Log entry, day 215, 12. Her name is Dr. Elise Moreau. She is 53 years old, a full professor of quantum decoherence physics at the Université de Sherbrooke, and the winner of the Gerhard Hertzberg Canada Gold Medal for Science and Engineering, which is the highest honor the Canadian scientific community gives one of its own. I cited her boundary coherence paper 14 times in my doctoral thesis. She cited my proton decay calibration work in 3 of hers. I have been reading her research for the better part of a decade without ever meeting her in person, because the quantum physics world in Quebec is collegial, but not small enough that everyone knows everyone, just small enough that everyone knows of everyone. 6 years ago, her daughter was killed by a driver who ran a red light on Rue King West in Sherbrooke on a Thursday afternoon in November. In an adjacent timeline, the light was green. I found the rest of it in the Veritech dossier summary, which Veritech Elliot had pushed through the boundary carrier in a series of compressed data packets during the last 3 minutes of our connection before the signal died. The summary was dry and factual in the way government documents are dry and factual, which is to say, it contained devastating information in the same tone you'd use to describe a parking violation. Dr. Moreau had spent 2 years after her daughter's death working on conventional grief. Therapy, colleagues, time. Then she had spent the following 2 years building a theoretical framework for directed quantum timeline convergence, which is the precise scientific term for what the rest of us would call collapsing the multiverse on purpose to pull a specific alternate reality into existence. And then she had spent the final 2 years actually building it. The Mandela effect was the side effect. The bleed-through of infinite adjacent timelines pressing against each other as the boundaries thinned. The Berenstein Bears, Forrest Gump's grammar, the Monopoly Man's monocle. All the small wrongnesses people had been cataloging on the internet for years. Not a psychological phenomenon. Not mass confabulation. The ambient noise of a physicist from Sherbrooke dismantling the walls between realities to get her daughter back. I sat at the console for a long time after reading this. There is an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation called The Inner Light. Picard gets hit by a probe and leaves an entire alternate life inside it. 40 years as a man named Catan on a dying planet. A wife and children and grandchildren and a whole world that isn't his. Then the probe shuts off and he's back on the bridge of the Enterprise. And it's been 25 minutes. He has to walk around for the rest of the series carrying 40 years of a life that didn't happen. And also his actual life, both of them equally real, neither one canceling the other out. I used to think the most unrealistic part of that episode was the probe. Turns out it was Picard functioning normally afterward. I understood Dr. Moreau completely. That was the problem. I understood her in the specific, cellular way you understand someone whose situation is the photographic negative of your own. She had collapsed timelines for love. I was trying to preserve mine to stay alone in it. Both of us were using particle physics to avoid accepting something we couldn't fix. My mother would have a word for that too. Several, probably. The boundary telemetry pulled me back. The targeted push at the service hatch had accelerated overnight. What had been an asymmetric deformation was now a pronounced indentation in the collapsed sphere, aimed directly at the weakest structural point in my module, like a thumb pressing into dough. The sensors were also showing something new in that section. The quantum coherence signature of the heavy water nearest the hatch was shifting. Heavy water shields me because deuterium, the heavy hydrogen isotope that makes it D2O rather than H2O, interacts with quantum fields differently than regular hydrogen does. The nuclear spin properties of deuterium are what make the shielding work. If the boundary decoherence was affecting the heavy water directly, converting its quantum state toward whatever the new timeline's water chemistry looked like, The shielding wasn't just being worn away from outside, it was being dissolved from within. I needed to counter it. The decoherence array I had been building was designed for one specific purpose: the full resonant excitation firing, both generators, both sides, microsecond synchronization with Veritech Elliot. Using any part of it prematurely, redirecting power to stabilize the heavy water coherence in one localized section, would compromise the synchronization timing for the full plan. It was using a surgical tool to do a rough job. The tool would survive, technically, but it wouldn't be quite as sharp afterward. I did it anyway, because the alternative was watching the hatch fail in approximately 4 hours. I rerouted 30% of the array's output into a localized coherence pulse aimed at the hatch side section of the tank. The quantum coherence readings in that section stabilized within 8 minutes. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. The full resonant excitation plan had just gotten approximately 30% harder to execute with the precision it required. I wrote this down. I have been writing a lot of things down. I tried to reach Veritech Elliot at 1340 using the boundary carrier method he had developed. I modulated the signal the way he had shown me and aimed it at the generator room's frequency band. No response. I tried again at 1355 and at 1410. Silence. I pulled up the sensor readings for the space adjacent to the porthole, the Veritech version of sublevel 6 that I had been able to see through the glass when the gantry lights were on. The quantum signature of that space had changed since my last reading. The collapse boundary between our two spaces had stabilized. Not collapsed. Stabilized. Settled into a fixed configuration rather than continuing to move. I stared at this for a long time and tried to determine what it meant. There were two possibilities, and the sensor data could not distinguish between them. The first was that Veritech Elliot had successfully stabilized his own bubble independently, anchoring his local timeline and creating a fixed boundary between his space and the general collapse. The second was that his timeline had fully merged with the new reality, and he had been overwritten, and the boundary had stabilized because there was no longer anything on the other side pushing back. One of those possibilities meant I had an ally I couldn't reach. The other meant I was completely alone. The sensor data looked the same either way. I sat in the ventilation hum, and the ozone smell, and the particular quality of recycled air that you stop noticing after the first month and start noticing again when you're frightened. And I looked at the stabilized boundary reading on my monitor, and I thought about Picard walking around the Enterprise carrying 40 years of a life he hadn't lived.